Good morning and welcome to the last webinar for 2018 for IMAT, and it's what a webinar it's turned out to be, with over 500 people registering to attend this. So thank you very much for those of you who've dialed in. It's a pleasure for us to be holding this event this year, and it's a symptom of how significant the changes that the advice profession is going through are, and the degree of attention which that's commanding amongst advisors and the broader managed account community. It's a pleasure for us today to have Simon Carrodus from the Fold Legal speak, and Tom Bignill, Managing Director of Mason Stevens, talking about the issues as Mason Stevens sees them and as they see them being reflected in their client base. Before I hand over to Simon, if you have a question to ask through the course of the webinar, you'll see on your screen a Q&A button. If you type your question in, we'll see it on the screen here, and we'll be able to deal with that. In talking with Simon, we're happy to deal with reasonable questions as we go through the session, rather than leaving them all to the end. The format of today, as I mentioned, will be Simon will give us a presentation on issues as the Fold see them around the impacts on advice of the Royal Commission and the changes that are associated with that. And Tom, through the course of this, will be discussing some of the consequences for their clients, and then at the end we'll open it up for broader discussion. Before we go on, let me just tell you briefly about upcoming events for 2019. So in March, we'll have the Advisor Roadshow for the third or fourth year in a row in Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne. And the theme of that will be the future of advice. In fact, I'm thinking of changing the title of the roadshow to "Does Advice Have a Future?" And then on the 29th of January, an investment forum at which we'll be looking at the outlook for investment markets for 2019 with Matt Drennan from Zurich. There's a question which has come up about the slides. So yes, at the end of today, the slides from both Fold Legal and from Mason Stevens will be available to all of you. You'll also be receiving from us a SurveyMonkey feedback form as we send out for all our events. So I'd encourage you all to complete that feedback form. It'll take you just a moment, but the slides will be available to you. So now let me hand over to Simon Carrodus from the Fold Legal to take us into his discussion about advice in a post-Royal Commission world.
Thanks, Toby. Appreciate it. First, just a little bit about me and my background. I've sort of gone full circle in my career and seen the industry from many angles. I actually started with ASIC many moons ago in their graduate program. And I worked briefly in it for a big law firm before moving into a big US fund manager for 7 years. And most recently, I spent 5 years in the legal team at a big four bank. And earlier this year, I joined the Fold. So the Fold is a specialist financial services law firm. We're passionate about the financial services industry, and we've been following the Royal Commission closely from day one. And really, we help our clients to future-proof their businesses so they can prosper in a post-Royal Commission world. So let's have a look at it. So the interim report, all 3 volumes of it, and 1,000 pages. Now, in the report, Commissioner Hayne, he conducts more than just an examination of compliance with the law. That's really ASIC's job. Hayne essentially tests the conduct against community expectations. So it's more than just a legal test, it's a moral test. In the interim report, Commissioner Hayne asked a lot of questions, but didn't provide any recommendations. So we have to wait until the 1st of February for those. So for the time being, we're all reading the tea leaves a little bit. Now, having said that, some of Hayne's views are really clear. We know that he's likely to recommend that grandfathered commissions should be phased out, for example. And we can take some guidance from the hundreds of submissions that the Commission's received, which are all public, in particular the submissions by ASIC and Treasury. It's important to remember that the Royal Commission does not have the power to make new law. All Commissioner Hayne can do is make recommendations. It's up to the government of the day to implement those recommendations or not. Now, we all know historically, governments generally only implement recommendations that suit them politically. You know, they pick and choose. And we saw this following the reports by David Murray, Bernie Ripoll Report, and the Ken Henry Tax Review, just to name a few. We think this time's a little different. There was a fair bit of goodwill towards the industry around FOFA time, 2011 to 2013. There's certainly not as much goodwill around this time, and there's a view that's been expressed in the media that FOFA started the job and the Royal Commission's going to finish the job. So, and we know both major parties have already announced they'll establish a task force to implement the Royal Commission's recommendations. And with the election looming most likely in May next year, there's major political points to be won in that gap between February and May. So this does put Commissioner Hayne in a very powerful position. Now, we're here for IMAP today, and I'm sitting across from Tom Bignill from Mason Stevens. So it makes sense to focus on how the Royal Commission's recommendations may affect advisors who recommend managed accounts to their clients, whether on or off platform, SMA, MDA. We're talking about managed accounts broadly because the issues we're going to talk about are the same. There's no doubt that managed accounts offer significant advantages to both clients and advisors. For clients, they offer flexibility, speed of implementation. There's scope for customization that you can't do in a unit trust. Clearly better after-tax outcomes and transparency of holdings. There are advantages to advisors as well. There's implementation efficiencies, definitely the potential for administrative cost savings, and greater control over client outcomes. But that does not mean that managed accounts are immune from the issues and the conflicts that have been highlighted throughout the Royal Commission. Two issues that are particularly relevant that I'm going to go into detail on today. And they're two issues that perhaps aren't that well understood in relation to managed accounts, in-house conflicts and ongoing service fees. So conflicts, the main conflict that arises with respect to managed accounts is when an advisor recommends a managed account to their client. And the managed account is provided by their RE or MDA provider. The managed account is provided by their licensee or related company, or even if it's not, where the advisor or their licensee provides services to that managed account and receives fees for doing so, usually portfolio management or investment oversight services, and they receive a fee. ASIC essentially calls these in-house recommendations. Now, you could call them conflicted recommendations, you could call them related party recommendations. It doesn't really matter. It's also important to note, as many of you know, that many managed accounts are actually a service rather than a product, but ASIC regulates them all as financial products. And again, it doesn't really affect the conflicts that are in place, and that's what we're going to talk about today. The main point is that whenever an advisor makes an in-house recommendation, a conflict arises because the advisor or their licensee or the corporate group more broadly stands to benefit financially if the client implements that recommendation. Now, if ASIC comes knocking, I can tell you there's no point trying to argue with them about whether or not a conflict exists. Whether you say we're using Chinese walls, there's no influence on the advisor, what have you. ASIC is adamant that the conflict does exist. They've made this really clear in their various submissions to the Royal Commission as well. And in a previous role with a big bank, I sat across the table from ASIC on numerous occasions and discussed this exact point, and I can tell you that there's nothing to be gained from denying that the conflict exists. It really just makes things worse. It's better to acknowledge the conflict and explain how you manage it. And we'll talk about how to manage it in a minute. And this brings us to this idea of structural separation. You can see the quote there from Commissioner Hayne. Structural separation would essentially preclude financial advisors from being in any way involved, whether in an ownership sense or a financial interest sense, any way involved with the financial products that they recommend to retail clients. So the key question facing Commissioner Hayne on this issue of structural separation is, is whether in-house conflicts can be managed or whether they need to be avoided through structural separation. Now, our view at the Fold is that the conflicts can be managed. They certainly haven't been managed well in the past, and we've seen, through the Royal Commission and also through ASIC Report 562, which I'll talk about in a minute. But just because it hasn't been managed doesn't mean that it can't be managed. Indeed, some firms are already managing this conflict very well. As such, our view is that structural separation would be a bridge too far at this point. And perhaps if the current rules are enforced more strictly by the regulators, and the change in attitude following the Royal Commission in the industry, that more firms can actually manage this conflict well. In addition, structural separation, in our view, would have some unintended consequences, such as increasing the cost of advice, as we saw in the UK, where retail clients were essentially shut out following the Retail Distribution Review in 2013. And UK Treasury is actually trying to undo that now, unwind it to a certain extent, bringing the big instos back into that retail space. Our view appears to be cautiously supported by both ASIC and Treasury in their respective submissions to the Royal Commission. Treasury stated that structural separation would be complex and disruptive and could have unintended consequences. ASIC stated that it should be possible for licensees to effectively manage in-house conflicts, and it should not be necessary to enforce separation of product and advice. That's the present view of ASIC and Treasury, around the middle of the year. However, we do, and this is important, we do expect ASIC to aggressively investigate in-house recommendations in the future, and in fact, this has already begun. So why don't we take a quick look at a closer look at the advisors' recommendations insofar as they relate to in-house conflicts. So there's a quick refresher on the best interest duty and related obligations. So first, the best interest duty. Everyone knows broadly what it is. There's the safe harbour. But where most advisors fail is, especially in the context of in-house recommendations, is they fail to properly research the client's existing product first, and they also fail to link their recommendations back to the specific needs and objectives of the client. So the advice ends up looking generic or cookie cutter. Secondly, the obligation to provide appropriate advice. What does this mean, appropriate advice? Well, it essentially means that you must explain how the advice addresses the client's needs and objectives. And secondly, why the advice is likely to leave the client in a better position. Third, and this is the most important in terms of in-house recommendations and in-house conflicts, the conflicts priority rule. We've already established that in-house recommendations give rise to a conflict of interests. The conflict priority rule requires advisors to prioritise their clients' interests over their own interests or those of their licensee or corporate group. Now, importantly, disclosing a conflict is not sufficient. The advisor must actually demonstrate that they gave priority to the client's interests. That is, explain why a managed account is better for this particular client than their existing product. So many of you will have heard about or read ASIC Report 562, released in January this year. It focused on the big five, that's the big four banks and AMP, and it examined 200 advice files where the client was switched out of an external product into an in-house product. And as you can see, the much publicised failure rate was 75%. As discussed earlier, the two main areas of non-compliance were failing to research the client's existing product and failing to explain why the in-house product was suitable for that particular client, linking back to their needs and objectives. ASIC in the report said they saw a lot of unnecessary replacement of financial products where the client's existing product was suitable and able to address the client's needs and objectives. Now, look, we think it would be naive to think that these conflicts are restricted to major financial institutions. Small and medium advice businesses, including those that offer in-house managed account services, they have to deal with the exact same conflicts, albeit on a smaller scale. And ASIC announced in May, James Shipton gave a speech and essentially announced that they do plan to expand the scope of Report 562 more broadly across the financial sector. So we have to be ready for that. Now, back to this 75% number, and this leads on, I want to focus on this for a second, because this 75% failure rate that you see there, and it was much publicised at the time, and it's actually referred to in Haynes' interim report, it's a little bit misleading. ASIC did not find that 75% of the advice provided was inappropriate. They found that 75% of the advice files they reviewed failed to demonstrate compliance with the best interest duty. And this brings me to my number one key learning from years of working on big bank investigations and remediation programs, and that is keep proper documentation. The message from ASIC is clear. If it isn't documented on the file, it didn't happen. So appropriate advice that is not documented is like a tree falling in the woods. This is not just best practice, by the way. This is the law. Section 912G requires advisors to keep records to demonstrate their compliance with the best interest duty. And if you look at ASIC Report 562 in detail, as I have, the issue is not that advisors had necessarily breached the law, though some clearly had. The issue was that there was nothing on file to evidence that they had complied with the law. So without proper documentation, you're effectively guilty until proven innocent on the best interest duty. So what on earth is an advisor supposed to do? Well, first of all, you have to accept that your in-house managed account offering or suite of offerings will not be suitable for every client that walks in the door. It's that simple. And if it's not suitable, you have to be prepared to either politely refuse to work with that client or research external products that may be more suitable to their needs and objectives. And in most cases, not all, but most, the client will have an existing product, and you're probably considering replacing their existing product with your in-house managed account. So in that case, clearly you need to research the client's existing product. And you need to understand that if the existing product is able to satisfy the client's needs and objectives, it is going to be more difficult to justify the recommendation to replace it. You then need to perform a like-for-like comparison between the existing product and the current product and actually do the analysis, pros and cons, and how that relates back to the client's stated needs and objectives and preferences, which you will have picked up at the start of the advice process. And again, note that replacement product advice will generally be inappropriate if the replacement product or the in-house product's fees are higher or the benefits are lower. Again, unless you can provide really clear justification that's linked back to the client's stated needs, objectives, and preferences. So the advisor needs to provide reasons, which is really where a lot of advisors have gone wrong over, not all, but a lot of advisors have gone wrong over the last sort of 5-6 years. Providing reasons to justify the replacement product recommendation. Now, in the context of managed accounts, the advisor must explain why the in-house managed account is better for the client. Not as good, it has to actually be better. There has to be an additional benefit to demonstrate that you've prioritized the client's interest. So why is it better for the client than the existing product? That is, how is it more likely to satisfy the client's needs and objectives than their existing product? And this analysis should be documented on the file and summarized in the SOA. Now, ASIC and at various times, FOS, now AFCA, and the FPA, look, there's been cases where they've been critical of advisors that have used these generic sort of cut and paste reasons to justify switches to in-house products. And these reasons are usually either product-centric or advisor-centric, whereas they should be client-centric. So you can see some examples there. You don't want to receive ongoing, you want to receive ongoing advice from me, and I don't advise on your existing product. The product provides regular reporting, online access, range of investment options. Again, that's product-centric. I've just lost our slide for a second. Again, this one, the product easily allows me to monitor your investments more easily. That's clearly not a justification to switch. And finally, this product allows your advice fees to be deducted directly from your account. Well, almost every product is providing that opportunity, the ability to do that now. Even the industry funds are on board. So, clearly these are inadequate reasons to switch products. You need to go deeper and essentially link back to, so for example, the second one, it's great that the recommended product provides all those things, regular reporting, online access, but has the client actually stated that that's important to them, that's a preference, that's something they want? If not, then it's, and ASIC's used that example in one of the examples in RG175. If that's not a stated client preference or goal or need, then it's irrelevant. So you need to drill down into their current product and also into the client's specific needs and objectives. So some better justifications, and these are necessarily brief, but some better justifications for replacing a client's existing product would be, you wanted a lower cost product. The recommended product has lower fees and costs than your existing product, okay? Or you wanted fixed insurance cover that does not reduce as you age. Your existing fund does not offer fixed insurance cover. The recommended fund does.
Now, Simon, there's a question which has come through from one of the attendees concerning the widening of APLs so that advisors have the opportunity to look at a broader range of offerings. Do you think this is one of the likely consequences of these changes? Not from a legal standpoint, no, because there's absolutely no obligation to have an APL. That's an industry norm. You can advise on as many or as few products as you wish. Of course, the narrower, if you only wanted to advise on your own in-house products, you'd just be in a situation where you still need to go through all of these legal obligations to test for suitability, compare with their current product. The reality is you need to be willing to reject or not work with a lot of clients. It'd almost like you'd be setting yourself up as a private club and saying, I only want to work with a small number of clients
a specific target market with specific needs that are suited to our in-house suite of managed accounts, and we don't want to work with any other clients. If you wanted to work with every single client that walked in the door, you'd need to have a much broader range of product offerings, because not every product is going to be suitable for every client. Yep. So I wanted to go on to the next issue now, the other major issue that, that is being examined closely by Commissioner Hayne. And this is an issue that affects all advisors, not just those that use managed accounts. That's the issue of ongoing service fees. So you can see the quote from Commissioner Hayne there about treating ongoing service fees like trail commissions. In fact, Hayne made numerous references to the industry's reliance on recurring passive income. And he was particularly damning of the fees for no service scandals that were highlighted in ASIC report 499. Now, quick recap of 499. This actually covered the big 6, not the big 5, so Macquarie was included. And this report found that 21 AFSLs, 21 licensees under that big 6, were found to have systemically failed to deliver services to their clients. And they were forced to refund hundreds of millions of dollars to those clients. Now, in some cases, the client had no advisor at all, orphan client. In other cases, the client was assigned to an advisor, but the advisor simply failed to provide the service. And more importantly, the licensee failed to monitor whether the service was being delivered or not. Often advisors had many hundreds of clients assigned to them, and they realistically were not in a position to service all of them. Hayne picked up on this, and he singled out licensees who, in his words, did nothing to prevent advisors having more customers on their books than they could advise annually. Now, some of you may be aware that ASIC recently sent out Section 912C notices to a range of advice businesses. And these notices were, essentially to test compliance with the FDS and renewal notice obligations for ongoing fee arrangements. But we like to think, you've got to think 2 steps ahead. What's ASIC doing next? So what is ASIC going to do with the data they collect? They're going to collect a lot of data about number of advisors in the business, number of clients, and number of clients who are paying ongoing fees. We think that their next move could be to have a more targeted investigation or a targeted surveillance, targeting advice businesses that have a high ratio of clients to advisors, that is, clients that are paying ongoing fees. So we need to be prepared for this. Ongoing service. So again, there's a quote from Hayne there. It's not just a question of fees for no service, it's also a question of fees for no value or little value. In ASIC's submission in May to the Royal Commission following round 2, the financial advice hearings, they suggested that many, perhaps even most clients who are paying an ongoing fee may not receive benefits that are commensurate with the cost. On this point, Hayne was critical of asset-based fees, saying that if the fee is a percentage of funds under advice, the question of value for money is all the more evident. ASIC echoed these thoughts, adding that asset-based fees, in their words, can have the undesirable effect of disincentivising an advisor from recommending strategies that might reduce assets under advice. For example, selling down investments to pay down debt. Finally, Hayne described the way that ongoing fees are charged. He described the way they're charged as invisible. ASIC also used the same word, invisible. ASIC said that it would be more likely that ongoing service would provide more meaningful value to a customer if the fee was required to be invoiced to the customer rather than being deducted automatically from the client's investment fund. We're talking about advisor service fees here, not portfolio management fees. So overall, look, it's clear that advice businesses will need to at least start considering whether they need to make changes to the way they structure their ongoing service fee arrangements. We know that every business is different, so there is no perfect model. Just like there is no one-size-fits-all client service fee model, there is no one-size-fits-all business structure or fee structure. But we regularly advise our clients to look at ways of future-proofing their business model in a number of key areas. Specifically, only recommending ongoing services that the client truly needs and values, so abandoning this one-size-fits-all approach. Secondly, clearly articulating the services to be provided and ensuring that they are actually delivered. Now, we think that clearly articulating the services, doing it internally and then getting used to presenting it to clients, that can actually help you justify your fees. And if you're providing really complex or detailed services, you may actually be able to charge more. It's something the industry needs to get better at, in our view. We think the industry in some ways undervalues itself. again, moving away from asset-based fees to dollar-based fees. Now, we don't think the Royal Commission will recommend that asset-based fees should be banned. We think they'll stop short of that, but we think there'll be a much higher level of scrutiny on asset-based advisor service fees. So we do expect a shift towards dollar-based fees in terms of justifying the value you're providing to the client. We think that advisors should consider setting their fees, dollar-based fees, according to the volume and the complexity of the work that they're actually doing for the client. And finally, we talk to our clients about reviewing and adapting their clients' ongoing service arrangements periodically. So not just set and forget, but sitting down with the client every now and then, just to ensure the client still needs and values the services that they're paying for. So that's all I had specifically prepared.
Now, so Tom, Simon's talked about fees and fee models. What do you see in the Mason Stevens client base of the models that they're applying?
Thanks, Toby. Look, we're seeing a variety of people. We have a lot of people, a lot of our clients who'll set up their own managed account offering, predominantly outsourced to fund managers or SMA managers, and they're running a structure over the top, using the benefit of the MDA to be able to have that discretion to change asset allocation and thus or allow the underlying managers to change positions within that portfolio. We call that a managed account service, as Simon's quite rightly pointed out. Whether it's a service or a product or a service, it's all seen through the same lens from ASIC's point of view, and probably that will come through. It gives benefits, of course, for the advisory practice for a scalable investment solution, and then has a range of benefits for the underlying client who are able to get those as well. So it's different about how you can charge and benefit from that. We're seeing a variety of differences. We've got a number of groups that have already or started to look at having a sort of structure, a fee structure in place where there's an annual retainer, which is a flat fee amount that offers services for the client. And then the advisor on top of that will charge an hourly rate for situational advice predominantly. And then there'll be an investment advice fee. So there are 3 very clear-cut fees as we've gone back and asked and surveyed our clients that we're seeing more and more. And the investment advice fee is once the advice placed to go into the managed account service, then there's a basis point on that investment piece of it. And that varies in terms of what that basis point charge is. It could be seen, and Simon and I have talked before, that there is a cost recovery there, because you need to put in place for any managed account service an investment committee that governs it, and that investment committee comes at a cost because you need external non-aligned people to your practice running that investment committee, and you need different skill sets, and those people come usually with a charge by way of an asset consultant or an independent chairman or something like that. And so there is a cost recovery there, and that's a bit of the fine line. You were talking before around the conflicts of in-house product and how you can charge for it, or can you charge for it. And, going back to what you said, is you can charge for it. It's just got to be disclosed. Do you want to draw out that a bit more?
Specifically, so we've got to differentiate between conflict of remuneration and the conflict, the in-house product or service conflict. So the fee itself, if we're talking about the investment advice fee, which is more to do with the management of the assets, that can be paid under the exemption around genuine express of specific consent, or clear consent and direction, as it's better known. So that essentially is an exemption to the conflict of remuneration issue. So we're not talking about conflict of rem, and I don't think we're really talking about value so much. It's talking about the acceptance of the fact that there is a conflict, because if the client accepts your recommendation as an advisor, act with a fiduciary obligation to act in their best interests, you will receive an additional fee for providing those services, valuable services, but providing those services and receiving a fee for providing those services in relation to the product or service you've recommended. So in our view, again, it's a conflict that can be managed but just hasn't been.
Yep.
And we think that it can be managed quite, really it can be managed by just simply complying with the law as it is. We sort of agree with Commissioner Hayne that, if ASIC, and look, we've had the best interest duty since 2013, or even before we knew 2011, 2012. ASIC really only started giving specific guidance and a few years after that, and really only enforcing it 18 months ago. So the whole industry has to accept the fact that this is going to be a real focus area for ASIC. And we just need to start, essentially complying and being ready for ASIC to enforce the laws that we already have.
And I think coming back to one of the points you made earlier, there are conflicts across all the different parts of the industry, and it's not about avoiding conflicts; it's about highlighting them and making it very clear now in the new world that they exist. And if you're not sure it is, then it probably is, and just highlighting that to the client, and that'll be their focus.
The law at the moment says that a conflict can exist, and you can also be acting in the best interests of the client. So if you can make it, and the whole point is you have to demonstrate and make it abundantly clear that yes, this conflict exists. However, here are the reasons why we still think this is the best strategy / product / service for you in your specific circumstances. You've said that these are your needs, objectives, and preferences. Based on that, here's what this thing can deliver, and here's what your existing product can't. And there may be some financial modelling involved, what have you. If you do all of that, essentially, you've justified the fact that the conflict exists, but it hasn't driven your advice. Your advice is driven by acting in the best interest of the client. The client's going to gain. You're going to leave them in a better position. All this stuff sounds simple, it's difficult in one sense that it has to be done each and every time. But the concept isn't difficult, and it just hasn't been done well in the past. But we think it can be done well.
Now there's a related question here from Tim in Melbourne, which says, Simon, how is ASIC in this context of charging fees? How is ASIC likely to view the fact that we re-sign client service agreements regularly and disclose fees on an annual basis, fee disclosure statement? So is this opt-in and FDS likely to get kind of a typical advice practice across the line?
So there's a view that and it's changed. I mean, there was a view that essentially opt-in and FDS sort of solved most of those problems. And I think there's a fair bit of merit in that. Doesn't go far enough. I mean, Hayne also mentioned in his report, asked the question, as he did ask about 675 questions in the report. One of them was, should advisors and clients need to come together and renegotiate their fee annually? So he didn't specifically use the word should opt-in be reduced to 1 year, but that sort of seems like what it should be.
Now, Tom, I mean, an MDA service requires the refreshing of that advice on an annual basis, doesn't it?
It does, yes. So the advisor must attest within a 13-month period, so typically after the review, that the MDA service is still, or the MDA is still applicable for that client and meets the client's needs.
The other important point on that, on Tim's question, is that Hayne also, when I mentioned briefly, Hayne also mentioned, it was actually it was Treasury that mentioned, and ASIC sort of echoed this idea that are the fees charged invisibly? So it's not just about whether there's value in them, but if we move to a system where they're actually invoiced to the client rather than being paid sort of automatically out of the client's investments, that'd be an interesting one, because then you'd sort of it wouldn't be an ongoing fee arrangement. So you do away with FDSs and opt-in anyway automatically. So again, that may be a bridge too far. And if that was one of the recommendations, there may be some exemptions to that. So we'll have to wait till February to see what happens on that. But that's the other sort of question around it, is not just the fees themselves, but how they're charged.
Well, coming back to something that you mentioned and touched on before, and again, coming under the banner of in-house product, and you create your own managed account solution. Do you want to talk us through, if you're taking a client who's got a model portfolio or a portfolio of managed funds, and you're moving them into an MDA with the portfolio of either the same or very similar types of managed funds, there's not a lot of cost differential if you are switching one or two managed funds. That's obviously requires a piece of advice. And you're moving them into a structure where you may or may not be taking a fee, so the fee differential may actually be negligible. Is that okay? Is it is that still deemed as in-house?
So the question I would ask, the first question, is it in-house, is the advisor in any way associated with either let's say it's an MDA provider,
Yep.
or receiving any sort of fees, even if it's just cost recovery, whether it's a compliance committee,
Yep.
or if there's any sort of financial association, ownership or financial association with the recommended product, and there isn't with the current product, then there's that in-house conflict.
Yep. So if you've got a layer over the top, which
Yeah.
is funding the investment committee, then it is deemed in-house and so forth.
That doesn't mean that it's not a better product. I mean, there's a variety. I mean, the reality is a lot of advisors, advice firms got into building their own sort of managed account solutions, initially white labeling and then moving into managed accounts and MDAs, because they thought they were just better solutions for their clients, right? That's okay. A lot of clients, advisors probably just got sick of the offerings that they thought were not responsive enough or not tailored enough to their clients' needs. So they built their own. So that's not the issue. The issue is just accepting the fact that, okay, I get on paper, it looks like I'm incentivized to recommend this to my clients. So I need to take an extra additional step to show that this is clearly in that particular client's best interest. And if you can't, if it's even Steven, you should actually say no. There needs to be an additional benefit. Because otherwise, why are you doing it? Why are you moving them out? So there has to be an additional benefit for the client.
So effectively, what that's saying, Simon, is that the default course of action is do nothing. My advice should leave you better off than the do nothing option.
Yeah, Treasury put forward a very interesting option, and it was just, they just put it forward as an option, almost as let's put it out there and see. That essentially that certain types of replacement product recommendations, and I think they're really leaning at in-house replacement product recommendations, should be sort of assumed to be inappropriate. So the starting position is, if you're switching them into an in-house product, it's assumed to be inappropriate unless you can sort of rebut that, and specifically demonstrate why it's not. So you're sort of guilty until proven innocent, and your starting position is don't do anything. And if you can't justify it, just say no. Either say, okay, look, you should stay where you are, or we'll research an external product, or just look, you're not a client that should be working with us, and we'll refer you down the road or politely say goodbye.
Well, I'm going to come back to that issue of cookie cutter, because I think it's one which I hear getting talked about, and I think we want to talk about it specifically. There's a question here from Tony. Did you just state that where the fees are invoiced to clients directly, an FDS and opt-in are not required? And of course, that turns that into...
Sorry, I was assuming that's on the assumption that the fees are invoiced sort of quarterly or half yearly or annually. So an ongoing fee arrangement has to be an arrangement that continues for more than 12 months. So that was sorry if I wasn't clear on that, Tony. Sorry, Tony.
Oh, no. Well, I do know of advisors, for example, who say to clients, this fee is, this year, this service is going to cost you $6,000. Now, I might in fact be invoicing that in 5 equal installments of $500, but it's a 12-month term arrangement.
Essentially, if the fee doesn't automatically continue over 12, so you're not going to continue invoicing them if they don't do nothing. If it's just a case of, here are the fees we expect, we're going to charge you, and here are the services we're going to provide you over the next 12 months, and here is the invoice, please pay, and they pay it, that covers them for 12 months and not a day longer. It's technically not an ongoing fee arrangement. It's an annual fee arrangement. So so the FDS and renewal notice obligations wouldn't apply.
So let's come back to the issue of cookie cutter. So ASIC turn up and they say, show us your client book and the services or investments that those clients hold. And lo and behold, it turns out that 85% of clients are in a managed account product. May or may not be an in-house product. They're in a managed account service of one sort, or they're in a single managed account service. So what are the responses to ASIC, and what are the things that an advice firm should be thinking about to avoid that becoming a difficult situation?
Yep. So there's probably two things. So the product design distribution obligations, and they're not law yet, but if they are enacted as they as the bill currently stands, all product providers, and that would include providers of managed accounts, would need to essentially have a suitability policy or a target market for their product, right? And you have to put in rules around how it should be distributed and who it should be provided to. We haven't drilled down on the detail on that yet, but you need to sort of show that you understand the target market for your product, and therefore you're filtering, aren't you? It's a triage process. So you need to demonstrate to ASIC, well, here's what we do. Some clients come in and they don't fit in our target market, and we say no, or we'll use an external product or whatever. Or recommend they stay where they are, or politely refuse to work with them. Others that do, they then sort of can come into our product. But again, though, the second test is, if they have a current product, we have to research, that current existing product, do a comparison analysis, and if we can establish that there is an advantage or a significant additional benefit of moving into our in-house product, we'll do it. If not, it may be that the managed account product is suitable for them broadly, but their current product is satisfying their needs completely, and there's no advantage of moving into your in-house managed account. In that case, you'd also need to, you wouldn't want to recommend they go in. So I just think it looks bad. This is not a strict legal comment, but it just looks bad if every single client that walks in the door ends up in your managed account or in your in-house product, right? It's going to be, I feel that ASIC would look at it and say, that's interesting. It's the fish that John West rejects. You've on a number of occasions said we're not going to actually work with this person. This is too sophisticated and complex for them. They just need a simple product or whatever it may be. It just looks, if ASIC sees that, and I'm not inside ASIC, but I just feel like it shows that you get it and you understand the conflicts and you've got the right mindset towards managing it.
And it's important to note that on the client file, obviously, which
is
it's
an interesting one, isn't it? Because if you refuse to serve it, if you don't take them on as a client, in theory, you don't have a client file. But I still think it wouldn't be a bad idea to be able to demonstrate to ASIC that, we had a client that came in a few weeks ago and we did this triage process and we just decided, in her particular scenario, this wasn't the best fit for them.
Or we were migrating people to a managed account offering, and this client really wasn't right for them, and that's the way that we're going to do our business going forward, and
exactly right.
So forth.
Yeah. So it's about moving away from this one size fits all.
And secondary, also having an ability to be able to facilitate for clients that don't fit into that managed account that might remain with the practice or dealer group.
Yeah, and that's your choice of business model.
Yeah.
Now, in the last few minutes of this webinar, the title of the webinar is, advice in a post-Royal Commission world. So let's have a chat now about what you think advice business models, forgetting managed accounts and all of this stuff. What will happen to advisors? What will advice business models look like? Tom, what do you think the future of dealers, licensees, and advisors is 2019 and onwards?
Oh, look, it's certainly going to be interesting to see how the next few years play out. There's an enormous amount of headwinds. There's an enormous amount of regulatory headwinds, as we know from the Royal Commission, that we'll find out about next year. And then, of course, you've got all of the FASEA educative standards that are coming down the pipe, and how advisors will deal with them. I think it's probably an interesting situation where we'll have a reduction in advisor numbers in the short term. How that gets fed through into the system in the longer term, as more people choose to become an advisor, we'll see. And it's going to create an enormous amount of opportunity for advisors with good business models to be able to pick up either clients or to grow their businesses in different ways. But I certainly think that we're going to see a reduction in advisor numbers and a change in business models as a result of the regulatory and educative standards.
Yeah, in the UK, I know that after their retail distribution review in 2013, they lost a quarter of their advisors. Yeah. So, and again, higher education standards, some sort of consolidated their businesses, some retired, some maybe they retired early, some just walked away. And there was a gap, and just the way that it sort of operated, they didn't actually enforce structural separation, but it operated almost the same way. And a lot of the big institutions just got out of retail. And
they were a bit different because they sliced grandfathering day one, didn't they?
Yeah. And
it was just over.
And they had two categories of advisors, the restricted or the independent.
Yeah.
And if there's even one area you couldn't advise on, you were this restricted financial advisor, which obviously didn't appeal to a lot of advisors. If they could cover sort of 97% of the market, that wasn't enough. So, but ultimately what happened was, through a variety of influences, only high net worth clients became what they call economically viable. And you good old-fashioned retail clients just simply weren't anymore. Either they couldn't afford to pay, or you could service them, but you'd go broke. And now the UK Treasury and the FCA over there have got this, they call it the Financial Advice Markets Review, and they're going the other direction. They're looking at sort of the ability to use technology, and there'll be some law reform as well to allow, more so they're trying to get the big instos to get back in and provide this sort of scalable, lower cost advice to, basic, simple advice to sort of genuine retail clients.
Just before we go on, Tom, for those who are participating in this, we've covered a lot of ground here, both in the discussion and in the slides. There'll be a recording of today's webinar available hopefully by tomorrow, along with the slides. So if you want to go over and recap the points which we've made, you will be able to get access to it.
The final challenge back on that point we were talking about in terms of advisors in the next few years, of course, will be the costs of giving advice. Obviously, we're going to see increasing compliance costs and increasing a compliance regime for a practice, but then, of course, you're going to have undoubtedly on the back of what we've seen this year, a sizable increase in insurance costs across the industry, and it'll now weigh up whether people end up having their own license or fold back into a dealer group, whether it's a mid-tier or a co-op or whatever it likes to be, which is an interesting situation given that you've got banks potentially getting out of the advice game, or certainly the soundings of such. So
yeah, so you've mentioned the licensing issue, Tom, and I was going to come to that. Now, Simon, the Fold has a view on whether we're actually likely to end up with individual licensing. This is the doctor and accountant model as opposed to the one we operate today.
So it's different. The two issues are self-licensing, which we're seeing a trend towards that already. That's a separate issue. But individual licensing, which, and again, in one of Haynes' 670 odd questions was, should advisors be individually licensed? And he's sort of getting into this idea that, should they report directly to ASIC rather than via a licensee? Licensees haven't been effective in many cases of enforcing the appropriate standards on their advisors. Look, we don't think it'll happen. We think this is it'd be back to the future, wouldn't it? The old dealer's license. A couple of reasons. First of all, ASIC's got enough on their plate, and specifically their licensing department is completely overwhelmed. They're incredibly busy. We work very closely with them. There's great people in there, but they, there's a lot of work and a lot of time involved in applying for a license. Not sure if they'd have a different sort of regime for individual licensing, but other thing is that individual licensing, it would set financial advisors apart from the rest of the financial services industry. I mean, the FSR regime and the financial services license regime applies to the whole industry. You've got underwriters and super funds and banks and everything else. They're all going to continue with the same AFSL regime, and then advisors would move into this self-license, individual license. We don't think that's practical. It's a question that's been asked, it's been raised. We could be wrong. We'll find out in February, but we don't think that'll be a recommendation.
Certainly, Commissioner Hayne does seem to me, as I read the interim report, to have in his mind this distinction between manufacturers, which is the banks, insurers, the managed account providers, investment managers, and advisors. And reading it, I sense a subtext which says advisors have a fiduciary obligation, manufacturers have their license and AFSL obligations. So I wouldn't be betting against this idea of individual licensing, but to your point, once you start to think through the practical applications of degree of compliance and responsibility imposed on licensees today, and try and apply that at an individual person level.
But almost in a new regime, specifically tailored to individuals. It couldn't be the same as the current regime, so, and that's a huge exercise.
All right, so look, as we wrap up now, are there any final points which either of you would like to make?
Really just my sort of view is that, there's a lot of doom and gloom around, and we deal with clients every day who are grappling with this. There are different sort of states of emotion, and some are sort of, still in the denial phase and really struggling with it. Others are sort of looking at it as an opportunity. We like to be optimistic. We do believe in the advice industry, and we think that firms that can sort of professionalise and adapt, there's that whole Darwin quote, I think it is, isn't it? It's the animals that can adapt to change that survive. Not necessarily the strongest or the most intelligent. You've got to be able to adapt. We think the professionalisation of this industry is a great thing. Yes, there's going to be some pain in the transition. Right now, really, really sucks because we've got the two worst things ever. We've got change, which we know is coming, and we've got uncertainty. So we know change is coming. We don't know what it is, right? So until February, and pretty much most of this year, it's been really, really hard. But we're sort of talking about most of our clients saying, look, don't wait till February. Well, now it's into November. December. It's almost Christmas. But we've been saying for a while, look, there's some things you can start to do to professionalise and sort of future-proof. We use that word a lot, future-proofing your business model. As I went through before, there's some key things you can start at least discussing now. February we'll have more information, then task forces will be announced. We'll get more information as we go, but trying to look at this as an opportunity, because the firms that come out the other side, whilst there'll be challenges, we think there's still, and we're already seeing businesses that are already really profitable undertaking this really professional, slightly different business model. Yeah.
And Tom?
Oh, look, I couldn't agree more. I think there is a huge opportunity. It's been a tough year in the headlines for the advice community, and at least we will get through the uncertainty and get some clarity come first quarter of next year. But that will present, we couldn't agree more, an enormous amount of opportunity for the advice industry and for advisors. You've got less numbers. All of this, a lot of this is all coming down to disclosure. And professionalising how and what it's done. If you're disclosing, if you're meeting all of the right best interests and so forth, then it's onwards and upwards.
Mm. Yeah. Look, Simon, Tom, thank you very much for your time today. We've covered a lot of ground. As I said, the recording and the slides from today's presentation will be available. You'll be sent a link to those along with the feedback form. In the Advisor Roadshow in March in Melbourne on the 14th, Brisbane on the 12th of March, Sydney on the 14th of March, and Melbourne on the 19th of March, we'll be canvassing exactly these issues. How will advice businesses with a managed account orientation face into the challenges that 2019 will bring? So vertical integration, cookie cutter, conflicted remuneration, best interest duties, ongoing fees. These are absolutely central to the topics which we'll be covering in that Advisor Roadshow. So, Tom, Simon, thanks very much for your time today. It's been great.
Thanks, Toby.
Thanks, Toby.